Could you survive as a Viking? Imagine freezing nights with no firewood, meals of dried fish and hard bread, and waking each day knowing battle might claim you before sunset. Life wasn't glory and gold, it was hunger, blood, and endless struggle. Life as a Viking was brutal. Could you endure it? The North was no place for the weak. Life as a Viking was brutal. Could you do it? From the first breath drawn in the icy air, a child of the North was not cradled in comfort, but cast into hardship. The wind screamed across the fjords, rattling the walls of longhouses, while snow pressed down on roofs like the hand of a god testing their strength. To be born into this world was to begin a battle for survival before a single step was taken. A Viking child's first lullaby was the howl of the storm, and their first lesson was that the world would not bend for them, it was they who must bend to it. Inside the longhouse, the fire cracked but gave little warmth. Smoke stung young eyes and clung to the hair and skin of every Viking man and woman within. The smell of goat hide, dried fish, and sweat mixed in the thick air, as mothers rocked infants in carved cradles, hoping they would last the winter. Many did not. To see a sibling carried out into the frost, wrapped in wool but silent as stone, was a memory that marked a child's soul forever. Life demanded sacrifice, and the gods collected it freely. The Viking child did not know of toys fashioned for play or idle hours of laughter. Their hands were given small tasks as soon as they could grip a scrap of wool to weave, a piece of wood to carve, a bucket to carry. Chores were not lessons, they were survival. Even gathering kindling in the bitter cold was a battle against the elements, with frost stiffening fingers until they burned raw. Yet no complaint was welcomed. A father's stern glance or a mother's sharp command reminded them that survival was the only mercy, and it was not given, but earned. Winter carved strength into them. Meals were scarce. Viking food often little more than thin porridge, dried fish, or hard bread softened in broth. On rare days, when a goat was slaughtered, the rich taste of fat and meat was as much a celebration as it was nourishment. But hunger was the constant teacher. It hardened the belly, dulled the cries of a Viking child, and forged a resilience that no feast could ever grant. Outside, the world gave no comfort. Winds knifed through wool cloaks, and snow buried paths until villages seemed swallowed by the earth. Yet within this endless storm, life endured. The Viking man, broad-shouldered and weathered by toil, rose before dawn to tend to livestock or split wood, his breath steaming in the frozen air. Beside him, the Viking woman carried burdens equal to his own, grinding grain, mending garments, and keeping the hearth alive with dwindling fuel. Children watched, learning not through words, but through the relentless rhythm of necessity. To be born into such a storm meant that weakness was not an option. Every Viking life began with hardship, sharpened by cold, shaped by hunger, and tested by endless labour. Those who faltered were left behind, and those who endured became the steel that the North demanded. A Viking child did not wonder whether they could survive, they simply did, because survival was the only truth they were ever allowed to know. From cradle to grave, their existence was bound to the storm, and it asked only one question: could you do it? From the moment a Viking child opened their eyes to the smoky rafters of a longhouse, their life was bound not only to the harsh earth, but to the unseen hand of gods and spirits. In the North, survival was not explained by chance. Every breath, every cry, every heartbeat of the infant was believed to rest on the favour of powers far greater than any Viking man or woman. Fate was no gentle guardian, it was a chain, already clasped tight around their cradle. The birth itself was not welcomed with idle cheer, but with solemn ritual. A newborn was sprinkled with water and lifted before kin to be named, their soul bound in that moment to family and fate alike. To leave a child unnamed was to leave them outside the order of men, abandoned to wander the cold halls of hell. Mothers whispered charms over the fragile bodies in their arms, binding them to Thor for strength, to Frigg for protection, to Freya for love and fertility. Even the smallest amulet of iron or bone tied around a neck was more than decoration. It was a shield against the lurking spirits that prowled the night, hungry for the young. For the Viking man and woman, superstition was not folly but survival. Every creak of the longhouse beam, every flicker of flame, every raven circling overhead spoke with meaning. The child's first steps might be guided by omens. A stumble to the left could be a warning of ill fate, while a firm stride to the right might be praised as a sign of future strength. Mothers laid Thor's hammer charms in the cradle, believing its power would guard against sickness. Fathers carved runes into wooden toys or into the lintel above the door, tracing protection into every corner of their home. Yet protection came at a cost. When illness struck, or when a child's wails grew weak, offerings were made. Bread left upon the earth, drops of ale spilled onto the ground, or in darker moments, a goat or lamb's life given so that the child's might be spared. These acts were not performed with doubt, but with grim certainty. To neglect the gods was to invite ruin, and no Viking family dared to risk the wrath of unseen forces. The longhouse itself became a temple of sorts. Smoke rising from the hearth was not only the mark of fire, but the voice of prayers carried upward. Women whispered charms as they stirred Viking food in the pot, each turn of the spoon a plea for health, each pinch of herb a promise of protection. When thunder cracked across the skies, fathers held children to the doorway, pointing upward. Thor speaks. He defends us still. In this way, the child learned early that their life was never their own. It belonged to gods, to spirits, and to fate itself. And always, fate loomed largest of all. The Norns, weaving the threads of destiny beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, were spoken of in hushed tones. A Viking child was taught that their path was already spun, their triumphs and their doom already tied in knots no mortal hand could untangle. Some accepted it as comfort that no matter how cruel the world, their life had meaning. Others saw it as a burden, a destiny too heavy to question, too certain to fight. To be cradled in the north was not simply to be rocked in a mother's arms, but to be held by unseen hands, gods who demanded, spirits who lingered, and fate that never loosened its grip. From the first breath, a Viking child's life was already spoken for, carried not only by flesh and blood, but by powers vast and merciless. It was a cradle of warmth and fear alike, a reminder that survival in the north was never only of the body, it was also of the spirit. The first lessons for a Viking child were never gentle. From the moment their legs found strength enough to carry them, life demanded labour, not play. There was no soft season of youth in the north, only the harsh schooling of necessity. A Viking boy might be handed a small axe before he had grown tall enough to lift it properly, while a Viking girl was set beside her mother at the loom or hearth, fingers pricked raw from wool or singed by sparks from the fire. Childhood was not a time of freedom, but the beginning of an endless march toward endurance. The longhouse itself became the first classroom. In its dim light, heavy with smoke and the musk of animals, children learned to obey the rhythm of survival. A Viking man's barked command could set a boy to fetch water from a half-frozen stream, his bare fingers stinging as he carried back the sloshing bucket. A Viking woman's sharp word might send her daughter out to gather herbs from the wet fields, frost still clinging to the leaves. Complaints were not welcomed. Weakness was a shadow that none could afford to carry. Even small tasks bore weight, for if a child faltered, a fire went cold, a pot stayed empty, or the animals grew restless. The lessons carved themselves into bone and flesh. Boys were taught to wrestle in the yard, grappling in mud and snow until their breath burned in their chests. Cuts, bruises, and broken skin were expected proof that the child was growing into something more than fragile flesh. Wooden swords, dull and heavy, slammed against small arms until the sting of pain became familiar. For the Viking boy, the shield was as much a part of him as his own hands, and he was drilled to raise it without hesitation, to let it bear the weight of blows until his arm no longer trembled. Girls bore trials no less fierce. Under the eye of their mothers, they learned the arts of survival, grinding grain until their arms ached, sewing until their fingers bled, tending the goats and cattle that meant the difference between famine and a full belly. To prepare, Viking food was no simple act of cooking, but an endless test of patience and strength, lifting heavy cauldrons, stirring for hours, and preserving enough for the long hunger of winter. A daughter who could not endure long toil by the fire was judged as harshly as a son who failed with spear or bow. Hunting brought another harsh schooling. Even the youngest were taken into the woods to watch as the men tracked deer or set snares for rabbits. They learned to move silently through the undergrowth, to notice every broken twig, every bent blade of grass. When an animal was killed, they were expected to stand close, to watch the life leave its eyes, and to understand that survival was never clean, never merciful. The blood that stained their hands was as much a lesson as the food that later filled their bellies. Discipline was woven through it all, a cold thread that left no softness. A Viking child who shirked their duty might feel the sting of a switch across their back, or the shame of public rebuke in front of kin. Yet even punishment was meant as forging, not cruelty. A lazy hand or a wandering mind could doom not only the child, but the entire household. In the north, every life was bound together, and every weakness threatened the whole. These first lessons stripped away the illusions of childhood. They carved into the spirit an understanding that life was toil, pain, and endurance, and that only through hardship could strength be born. A Viking child did not ask whether they could endure, it was demanded of them. And as the winds howled outside the longhouse walls, as frost bit their skin and labour bent their backs, they learned the truth of their world. Survival was the only mercy, and it had to be earned every day. The land of the north was both cradle and executioner. Fire and frost were not just elements to the Viking people. They were teachers merciless, unrelenting, and always watching. A Viking child grew not in a world of gentle seasons, but in one where summer was short and fleeting, and winter stretched on like an endless punishment. The ground itself seemed to resist them, rocky fields that yielded little, soil so thin it clung stubbornly to life. To eat, to live, to draw another breath, was to fight against the very earth and sky. Frost was the first lesson. It crept into longhouses through cracks in the timber, biting at toes and fingers, even as families huddled around the hearth. A Viking man might rise before dawn to find livestock frozen stiff, their death a warning of how quickly life could be claimed by the cold. A Viking woman might weep quietly when the last of the stored grain ran thin, her tears drying before they froze. For the children, frost was a constant companion, biting their skin until it burned, forcing them to learn that pain was part of survival. To falter in the face of cold meant death, and no one in the village had strength to spare for the weak. Yet fire taught its own lessons. In the longhouse, the hearth was both guardian and tyrant. Without it, there was no warmth, no Viking food, no safety from the shadows that pressed in with every winter night. But fire devoured as it gave fuel had to be cut, gathered, and carried daily, even when snow lay waist deep. A Viking child was sent to fetch wood as soon as they could walk, their arms trembling beneath the weight of frozen logs. Those who failed found only scolding or the sharper lesson of hunger and cold. The sea, too, was a merciless tutor. Its waves were iron grey, rolling and heaving with a violence that made every crossing a gamble. To the Viking man who rowed against its wrath, the ocean was both a road to fortune and a grave waiting to be filled. To the Viking child watching from the shore, it was a reminder that their people's fate lay tied to waters that could not be tamed. Ships were splintered in storms, fishermen swallowed by waves, yet still the boats went out. Hunger had no patience for fear, and the sea demanded courage in exchange for life. The harvest brought no guarantees. Thin soil and short summers left families praying to the gods for crops to ripen before frost returned. A poor season meant lean months of chewing dried fish and stale bread, of stretching meagre stores until they broke. Children learned early the taste of hunger, the hollow ache in their bellies teaching them what no words could. The land gave little, and even that little had to be wrestled from it. Viking food was not a feast, but a victory, won only through toil. But it was in the storm that the final lesson came. When winds howled across the fjords and snow buried doorways, the family drew close around the hearth, listening to the world outside as if giants raged in the dark. It was in these moments that a Viking child understood the truth of their life. They were not masters of the world, but its challengers, standing each day against frost, fire, sea, and storm. Forged by fire and frost, they grew into iron, their bodies hardened by cold, their spirits tempered by hunger, their courage sharpened by storms. The land did not pity them, but in its cruelty it gave them strength. And in the end, it was that strength that allowed the Viking to endure where others would have withered and vanished into the snow. A Viking child learned quickly that food was not pleasure, it was survival. In the north, eating to live was a daily struggle, and every bowl, every mouthful carried the weight of the land's meagre generosity. Viking food was never laid out in splendour save for rare feasts. More often it was thin porridge that clung to the sides of a wooden bowl, or strips of dried fish so tough they bent teeth before they broke. Goat's milk, sharp and sour, might be poured into small cups for children, a blessing on some days, a burden on others. The hunger never truly left, not even in summer when the earth was green, for all knew winter was waiting, ready to take back whatever small bounty the land had granted. Morning meals were nothing to stir excitement. A Viking man rose before dawn, his first task to break the fast, with little more than bread, hard as stone, softened in water or ale. A Viking woman ladled thin gruel into bowls. Oats boiled until they lost all flavour, but gave strength enough to swing the axe or tend the fields. For children, there was no complaint. Their small bellies grumbled, but were silenced with the same fare, learning early that food was not meant to delight, but to sustain. Fish was the backbone of survival. Salted, dried, or smoked, it hung from rafters in longhouses, filling the air with its sharp, pungent scent. It was Viking food for every season, eaten daily until the tongue longed for anything else. On coasts, the men cast nets and lines, braving icy waters to fill the barrels that would keep their families alive through winter's grasp. Yet even inland, fish was carried, traded, and stored, a currency as much as a meal. Meat was rarer. A slaughtered goat or pig was an event, its fat treasured above all else. Viking children were given morsels of the richest cuts, not out of softness, but because they needed strength to grow. Every part of the animal was consumed, the flesh roasted or stewed, the bones boiled for broth, the fat rendered into cooking oil. Nothing was wasted, for to waste was to insult both the gods and survival itself. Feasts, when they came, stood apart like bursts of sunlight in the storm. A victorious raid, a bountiful harvest, or a sacred holy day might see tables groaning with roasted meat, bread, fresh from the oven, cheeses, and barrels of ale. The longhouse would ring with laughter, the Viking man lifting his horn high, the Viking woman smiling as children gnawed greasy bones. Yet even in these moments of joy, none forgot the hunger that always followed. Feasts were fleeting. The porridge and dried fish always waited to return. Foraging filled the gaps. Women and children scoured forests and fields for berries, nuts, and herbs. Mushrooms were gathered with care, their shapes debated, for some carried nourishment while others promised death. In lean times, bark was ground into meal, and seaweed dried into brittle sheets that crackled between the teeth. These foods were not chosen, they were endured. Winter was the harshest teacher of all. Stores dwindled, barrels grew light, and families measured each bowl with painful precision. Hunger gnawed at bellies while the snow piled high outside, and more than one Viking child went to sleep with nothing but a prayer for food in their dreams. In these months, survival meant sharing what little there was, or watching loved ones fade into silence. To eat in the Viking world was never simple. It was a daily reminder of struggle, of how thin the line was between strength and starvation. Viking food was not crafted for joy, but for endurance. Each bite a battle won against hunger, each meal proof that life, though harsh, still clung to the body. And so they ate, not to feast, but to survive another day beneath the cold sky of the north. The Longhouse was the beating heart of Viking life, a place of both warmth and suffocation, comfort and burden. Step inside, and you would know at once what it meant to be a Viking. Smoke curled thick from the central hearth, stinging the eyes, blackening the rafters, and clinging to hair and skin until its scent never left. The fire roared and crackled, not for cheer, but for survival, its light pushing back the long northern nights. Around it gathered family, thralls, and beasts alike, all bound beneath one timbered roof, breathing the same heavy air. A Viking child grew up in this haze, learning to sleep through the coughing of elders, the bleating of goats, and the low growl of dogs chained near the door. Privacy did not exist. Every cough, every whispered word, every quarrel was heard by all. Yet within this closeness lay strength. The Longhouse was not merely a shelter of wood and turf. It was the shield against frost, wolves, and the endless dark. When storms battered the land and snow buried the world outside, the Longhouse stood as the last line of defence, a womb of survival forged from sweat, smoke, and kinship. Along its walls lay raised platforms, covered in furs and straw, where Viking men and women lay side by side, children curled between them like pups in a litter. Beneath those same benches, animals were tethered, their warmth as vital as their milk or meat. The snorts of pigs, the shifting hooves of goats, and the rustling of hens were as constant as the crackle of firewood. The Viking man might rise in the night to check the animals, for their loss was as dangerous as the loss of kin. The Longhouse was both home and barn, life pressed together so tightly that the line between man and beast blurred. Thralls, the slaves of Viking households, moved silently within the same walls. They stirred the fires, fetched water, mended tools, and bore the brunt of endless commands. They ate last, slept in corners, and carried the weight of the household's labour on their backs. Yet their presence was as normal as the smoke or the smell of dung. They too were threads in the fabric of the Longhouse world, though always beneath the heel of those they served. The Longhouse was not silent. It hummed with the rhythm of daily life, the scrape of whetstone against blade, the crack of loom weights as women wove, the splash of broth ladled into wooden bowls. At night, the silence was filled by the sound of tales. A Viking man might raise his voice to tell of old battles, of ships that cut across the whale road, of kin who fought bravely and died with honour. The children listened wide-eyed, the glow of firelight painting sagas across their imaginations. In these stories, the walls themselves seemed to lean closer, as if the very timbers hungered for the sound of glory. But as much as the Longhouse nurtured, it suffocated. The air was heavy with smoke that never fully escaped through the smoke hole. Eyes watered, lungs coughed, and sickness spread swiftly through the cramped space. Lice and fleas thrived in the warmth, feasting without end. To the outsider, it may have seemed misery, but to the Viking, it was life rough, close, and unyielding. The Longhouse was a forge of endurance. It gave shelter, yet demanded patience. It offered warmth, yet filled the lungs with choking smoke. It was the world in miniature, binding family, thrall, and beast into a single breathing organism that lived and endured together. For every Viking child, the Longhouse was the first universe they knew, a place where bonds were strengthened, stories were born, and survival was decided night after night. It was not simply a house of timber. It was a crucible, shaping every Viking soul within its smoky embrace. Childhood among the Northmen was no gentle span of innocence. A Viking child was tested from the start, their games little more than shadows of war, their laughter often ending in bloodied lips or bruised limbs. Where in other lands children might be sheltered, in the world of the Viking man and woman, every trial of youth was sharpened towards survival and strength. To falter in these early tests was to mark oneself as weak, and weakness had no place in a world carved by axe and sea. The fields and yards of villages were training grounds as much as they were places of play. Boys gathered with wooden swords and shields made from planks, clashing until arms ached and shins carried dark welts. The rules were few, and the lessons clear. Hold your shield high, strike when the enemy falters, and endure the blows without complaint. A Viking child who cried or quit was mocked, sometimes cuffed by his own father, for war would not spare tears. The stronger ones pressed their advantage, learning early that mercy was a luxury best left for sagas, not the battlefield. Wrestling was another trial, a brutal dance on the packed dirt of the yard. Locked together, Viking boys threw each other down with bone-jarring force, their bodies smeared with mud and sweat, their lungs heaving with effort. A broken nose, a dislocated arm, these were not rare, but accepted as part of growing. Even the smallest child was expected to stand his ground, to fight until pinned, and to rise again with grit in his eyes. Girls, too, were not spared. While they did not always wield the wooden sword, they wrestled and ran, learning endurance that would serve them in the labours of field and home. Mock duels carried a darker edge. With blunted iron or sharpened sticks, boys practiced strikes and parries that sometimes cut deeper than intended. Bloodied foreheads, split lips, and swollen knuckles became marks of pride. They were proof that a Viking child was hardening, that pain could be endured. Fathers looked on without flinching, knowing these small wounds prepared their sons for larger battles to come. Even a Viking woman, tending the fire or weaving wool, would glance up at her son's bruises and nod, for she knew those bruises meant he would live when the shield wall closed. But these trials were not only of weapon and fist. Endurance was tested in games of cold and hunger. Boys plunged into icy rivers, racing to see who could withstand the chill longest, their teeth chattering, their lips blue. Some fainted, dragged out by their kin, but those who lasted earned praise as if they had faced a sea storm alone. Hunger Games tested, while fasting for a day while others ate, watching who would endure the gnawing ache without begging for Viking food. These contests shaped more than muscle. They shaped the spirit to endure hardship without breaking. Every trial was steeped in risk, and sometimes a game claimed a life. A child struck too hard in a duel, a fall on frozen ground, or a drowning in icy waters could turn play into mourning. Yet grief was met not with softness, but with silence, a grim reminder that even in youth, death was never far. The surviving children learned more from loss than from victory. Life was fragile, and only strength held it firm. So the childhood of the Viking was not cushioned, but carved by trial. Through bruises, through blood, through bitter cold and aching hunger, they were forged. These trials were no cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were the first steps toward becoming warriors, farmers, sailors, and survivors in a world that demanded nothing less. A Viking child who endured them bore the marks of strength, and in those marks lay the proof that they could someday stand unyielding in the storm. The Viking lived beneath the gaze of gods, both fierce and merciless. To worship and to fear was one and the same, for the gods of the north did not cradle men with gentleness. They demanded sacrifice, obedience, and courage. Life was measured in omens, every sound of raven wings or crack of thunder believed to carry the voice of higher powers. From the cradle to the grave, a Viking child was taught that their fate was bound to Odin's will, and that every breath they drew was permitted only so long as the gods allowed it. Ritual was woven into the very rhythm of their days. A Viking man setting out on the sea would pour ale onto the waves, a gift to Njord for calm waters. A Viking woman preparing Viking food for a feast might set aside a portion of bread or meat, laying it by the hearth as an offering to the household spirits. In the stillness of dawn, charms were whispered, runes traced in ash or carved into wood. Each stroke of the knife a plea for favour, each word a hedge against disaster. The people lived not by chance, but by bargain, constantly striving to keep the unseen forces appeased. Sacrifices were the language the gods understood best. Animals were led to sacred groves or temple sites. Their blood spilled onto the earth as a bond between men and the divine. Goats, oxen, and horses were given, their deaths seen as payment for good harvests, victory in raids, or protection from plague. The meat was cooked and shared, the Viking food consumed with reverence, for in eating it the people believed they bound themselves closer to the gods. But not all offerings were beasts. In times of great need, darker sacrifices were whispered of slaves, criminals, and in ancient memory, even kin offered to Odin upon the tree or to Thor in fire. Such acts were not spoken lightly, but neither were they denied. Omens guided every choice. A raven flying east might mean safe passage, while a stumble before leaving home could foretell death. Dreams were dissected like the entrails of beasts, each image a sign from beyond. A Viking child learned to listen for these signs, to watch the skies, to heed the wisdom of elders who claimed to see further than mortal sight. Fear and reverence walked hand in hand, for to ignore the omens was to spit in the face of fate itself. Above all loomed Odin, the All-Father, one-eyed wanderer, god of wisdom and war. His was not a tender guardianship, but a relentless demand for strength and sacrifice. He hung upon the world tree to win knowledge. He traded his eye for sight into the unknown, and he asked no less of his followers. Warriors prayed for his favour before battle, knowing that only those who died bravely could hope to be carried to Valhalla by the Valkyries. To fall with courage was to feast with the gods. To fall with fear was to vanish into hell's cold halls. Thor was the shield of the common folk, his hammer raised against giants and storms alike. When thunder rolled, Viking children were told it was Thor riding in the sky, his hammer striking to protect them. Yet even he demanded offerings, his name invoked over the sick, over newborns, over harvest fields where strength was needed. Freya, goddess of love and war, claimed her share of the slain, reminding all that the afterlife was not promised only to men but to women as well, fierce and enduring. To live as a Viking was to walk daily in the shadow of these gods, bound by ritual, sacrifice, and fear. Their power was never doubted, their hunger never ignored. A Viking child learned early to bow their head, to offer what little they had, and to accept that their fate was already woven by hands beyond their reach. In every flame, in every storm, in every omen traced across the sky, the gods were watching, and mercy was not their way. First blood was the moment a Viking child ceased to be a child. It was not marked by gentle words or songs, but by the sharp taste of fear and the iron scent of blood in the air. To take life or to bleed in the act of learning was the true passage into the world of the Viking man and woman. Without it, no words, no chores, no training meant anything. The North demanded proof written in flesh. For many, that proof came with the hunt. A boy of 12 might be given a spear, his father's stern eyes upon him as they tracked a deer through the frost-bitten woods. Hours of silence, every crunch of snow beneath his boots, seeming too loud, every breath clouding the air like a banner to the prey. When the moment came, there was no hesitation allowed. The spear was thrust, the animal struck, and as it fell thrashing, the boy was ordered to finish it. To watch the light leave the eyes of his first kill was to understand the weight of life that all survival was bought with death. A Viking child who balked, who hesitated, was shamed, for the gods themselves demanded courage in the taking of life. For others, first blood was their own, wrestling on frozen earth, sparring with wooden blades, or gripping real steel when play tipped into danger. Wounds were not accidents but teachers. A split lip, a gash across the brow, a broken tooth, these were not reasons for pity, but badges of growth. Fathers examined the wounds, mothers cleaned them with rough hands, and both expected the child to stand tall despite the sting. A Viking woman would mutter, "Good, now you know what pain tastes like," as she pressed a cloth to the cut. It was not cruelty, but preparation. The world beyond their hearth would be far harsher. Sometimes the two rites met in one. A boy or girl out with kin might cut themselves dressing a kill, their blood mingling with the animals, as if binding them together in some unspoken oath. It was not unusual for such moments to be spoken of in hushed pride, the first real sign that a Viking child's body was no longer spared from the trials of their people. The day of first blood was remembered not for the wound itself, but for what it meant. It proved the child could stand against fear, could hold steady when their hands trembled, could rise even as pain pressed down upon them. It was a mark carried not on the skin, but in the spirit. A Viking man remembered his first kill with pride, even in old age. A Viking woman remembered the first time she seared her hand, pulling pots from the fire, or spilled her own blood in the fields, yet carried on without pause. These memories bound them, proof that they were no longer fragile, no longer babes, but part of the unyielding chain of their kin. No feasts were thrown, no banners raised for this passage. Often it was marked by nothing more than a nod from a father, or the quiet smile of a mother as she saw steel enter her child's gaze. Yet in those small gestures lay the greatest acknowledgement of all. The child had stepped into the storm and endured. First blood was not a choice. It was the demand of the land, the gods, and the people themselves. In shedding it, or in taking it, a Viking child proved they belonged to the brutal rhythm of their world. From that day forward, they could never return to innocence. They had bled, and by blood they had become. The burden of the Viking woman was not carried in silence, but it was heavy all the same. While the Viking man sailed to foreign shores with axe and shield, it was she who bore the weight of home, land, and kin. Her strength was not forged in the clash of steel, but in the endless toil of days that demanded as much courage as any raid. Marriage bound her not only to a husband, but to his family, his farm, his fortune, or his ruin. From the moment her hands tied the knots of wedlock, she shouldered responsibilities that could crush the unprepared. Childbirth was her first battlefield. In the dim light of the longhouse, with only women gathered around her, she fought with screams and blood, offering her body as a vessel for the next generation of warriors and farmers. There was no certainty in the struggle. A Viking woman knew that death might come with labour, as swift as any sword stroke, yet still she endured. Each child born was both a victory and another weight added to her back, for mouths must be fed, clothed, and kept alive through winters that showed no mercy. When the men sailed, the true measure of her strength was revealed. Alone she ruled the household. Crops had to be sown, harvested, and guarded from storms or thieves. Animals had to be tended, their milk and meat the thin line between survival and hunger. Viking food did not gather itself, and a farm left untended was as dangerous as an enemy blade. A Viking woman rose before the sun and worked long after it set, her hands blistered from the plough, her back bent beneath the weight of labour. Children looked to her as both mother and father, and she bore it without complaint, for she knew that if she faltered, her family's ruin would follow. She also carried the burden of law and honour. Keys hung from her belt, symbols of her authority in the household. With them, she commanded thralls, decided the use of stores, and defended property in her husband's absence. If a quarrel arose, it was she who stood before neighbours, her tongue as sharp as any spear, defending her family's rights. A Viking woman's word carried weight, and though men might scoff, they knew well that a house without her was a house undone. Yet for all her strength, her burdens carried loneliness. Nights were long, with only the crackle of the hearth and the howling of the wind for company. Each storm that rose on the sea was a knife of fear. Was her husband drowned, her sons lost, her farm now hers to bear alone? She prayed to the gods, leaving offerings for safe returns, but also hardened her heart for the chance that prayers might go unanswered. Still, she did not break. In the sagas, the Viking man's valour is sung, but behind every tale of victory stood a woman who had held the farm together, who had kept children alive, who had endured hunger, grief, and solitude so that her people could march to war without looking back. Her burden was not less than his, but different, a burden of constancy, of unseen endurance, of steel woven not into mail, but into spirit. To be a Viking woman was to fight a war without end, a war against hunger, against loneliness, against the weight of responsibility that never loosened its grip. And though no skalds sang her name in the great halls, her strength was the reason her people endured. Without her, the longhouse would crumble, the farm would fall silent, and the line of warriors would fade into the cold. Hers was a burden carried not with song, but with unyielding will. The Viking slave, the thrall, was the shadow that kept the longhouse standing and the farm alive. They were the unseen backbone of Viking life, yet their lives were marked only by toil, obedience, and the sharp hand of their masters. While the Viking man took pride in his sword, and the Viking woman in her keys of household authority, the thrall bore no pride, only chains that bound them to endless labour. Their presence was so common that to the freeborn they were like the smoke in the rafters, always there, always necessary, yet seldom spoken of, except as tools. Thralls were taken as plunder. A raid upon foreign shores did not always end with gold or silver, but with human lives dragged screaming to the longships. Women, men, and even Viking children stolen from distant villages were forced into servitude, their freedom stripped as surely as their clothes. Some were bought in trade from other lands, others born into slavery, never knowing the taste of liberty. To be a thrall was to have no will of your own, your body and labour belonging entirely to your master. Their work was endless. In the longhouse, thralls stoked fires, fetched water, cleaned the filth of beasts, and endured the commands of every freeborn tongue. In the fields, they bent their backs to the plough, cutting furrows through stubborn earth, sowing seeds, and harvesting crops that would never fill their own bowls. A Viking woman directed them with the authority of her keys, a Viking man with the strength of his whip or fist. Their reward was survival, a portion of Viking food no better than scraps, and even that only if their work was done well. Their lives were marked not only by toil, but by brutality. A thrall who faltered could be beaten, mutilated, or even killed without consequence, for they were not considered people in the eyes of the law, but property. They could be traded like cattle, gifted as dowry, or sacrificed to the gods as offerings. Tales whispered of thralls hanged in sacred groves, their deaths meant to please Odin or Thor, their cries swallowed by the wind. For the freeborn, such rituals carried weight. For the thrall, they were another reminder that their lives were worth less than the axe that struck them. Yet even in this darkness, survival bred its own kind of strength. Some thralls carved out small spaces of endurance, forming bonds with others in chains, sharing whispered comfort in the shadows of the longhouse. A thrall might cling to the hope of freedom, for manumission was rare, but not impossible. A master might reward loyalty with release, granting a thrall land or rights as a freedman. Some who gained freedom took new names, started families, and tried to bury the memory of their bondage. Others never escaped. their bones lying forgotten in the fields they had tended for lives not their own. Children of thralls carried their parents' burden. Born into servitude, they grew up alongside the Viking child, but never as equals. One fetched water, while the other practiced with wooden swords. One carried wood for the hearth, while the other sat at the father's feet to hear the sagas. It was a cruel mirror, showing that fate was not always forged by effort, but chained by birth. The Viking world sang of heroes, of warriors, of gods who demanded bravery and sacrifice. Yet behind the clang of sword and the smoke of feast, it was the thralls who laboured unseen, who stitched the fabric of survival with hands that would never hold honour. They were the foundation no one praised, the breath of society given no song. And though their voices were silenced, the weight they carried was as vital as the axe in battle or the ship upon the sea. Without the Viking slave, the house of the freeborn would crumble. But with them, life endured, cruel and unyielding. Training for war began before a Viking child had the strength to lift a true weapon. From the earliest years, their play was shaped by the shadow of battle, their games harsher than lessons, their laughter often ending with bruises that only hardened them further. A stick became a spear, a wooden board, a shield, and from those simple tools grew the muscle and spirit that would one day stand in the shield wall. To live in the north was to know that war would come, and the only choice was to be ready when it did. The axe was often the first companion of a Viking boy. Heavy, unwieldy, its iron head biting through wood before ever meeting flesh. To chop timber was training as much as it was labour, each swing building the strength that would one day cleave through helm and bone. Fathers corrected their sons with curt words, adjusting grip and stance, demanding precision and endurance. Calluses thickened on palms until the axe became as natural to hold as breath itself. A Viking man was measured not only by how many trees he felled, but by how he would wield that same motion in battle. The shield was a lesson in patience and pain. Round and broad, it demanded strength of arm and steadiness of spirit. Viking children stood shoulder to shoulder, raising their shields against stones hurled by their kin, learning to absorb the blow without flinching. Each bruise was proof, each aching arm a step closer to endurance. In time, they learned to lock their shields together, to become one body with their brothers, the line unbroken. Behind that wall, courage was born, but the cost was hours of practice until muscles screamed and sweat dripped into the dirt. The bow, though less celebrated, demanded its own brutality. The yew longbow bent only to strength, its draw weight enough to warp bone and twist the spine of a Viking man who practiced daily. Children began with smaller bows, their fingers rubbed raw, their shoulders burning with each pull. Arrows flew again and again, not only at wooden targets but into the carcasses of beasts, teaching the child that each shaft carried death. The Viking archer was not made in comfort, but in repetition, so relentless that the body itself reshaped to endure the strain. Training did not end with daylight. Evenings in the longhouse often turned to contests, where young men grappled in the smoke-filled space, testing strength until one was pressed into the dirt. The Viking woman encouraged these trials as much as the men, for she knew her sons must be forged hard if they were to live through the storm of war. Pain was not scorned but praised, and a bloodied lip or swollen eye earned no sympathy, only the nod of approval that told the child they were becoming what fate required. But war demanded more than muscle. It required cunning, instinct, and the will to endure fear. Children learned the stories of raids, of tactics whispered around the hearth, of how to strike when the enemy faltered, and how to stand firm when death pressed close. They were told of Odin's watchful eye, of Valkyries soaring above the battlefield, and of the glory of dying with courage. To train for war was not merely to sharpen the body, but to shape the spirit until it welcomed the clash, until even fear was dulled into resolve. By the time a Viking child grew into youth, their hands were no longer soft, but roughened with scars. Their arms carried strength, their backs carried discipline, and their minds carried the certainty that one day they would be tested not in play, but in blood. Training for war was endless, relentless, and often cruel, but it was the only path to survival in a world where the sword, the axe, and the bow ruled all. And so, aching bones and calloused hands became weapons, until the child themselves was as sharp as the steel they carried. The march to battle was a war of its own, one that broke the weak long before the enemy's steel was ever drawn. For the Viking man, the road to combat meant burden, hunger, and exhaustion that bit as sharply as any blade. It was a trial where every step was earned, and only those with iron in their spirit could reach the battlefield ready to stand. They rose before the sun, the cold biting through cloaks, still heavy with dew. Viking food was scarce on such days, little more than a crust of hard bread or a strip of dried fish chewed as they walked. Hunger clung to their bellies like a wolf, gnawing deeper with every mile. Yet there was no pausing to rest, no warm hearth waiting only the endless press of boots on soil, carrying them toward an enemy they had not yet seen. A Viking child who had once carried buckets of water or bundles of wood grew into the man now bearing his life upon his back. The weight was merciless. Shields slung over shoulders, axes at the belt, bows and spears clutched tight, each weapon that promised survival adding to the burden. Helmets pressed against brows, cloaks grew heavy with damp, and packs carried food stores, spare strings, and tools to mend what might break. In all, a Viking marched with more than half his body's weight dragging at him, each step a battle between will and flesh. Some staggered, some fell, but there was no pity. To fall behind was to be left, and to be left was to die. The land itself was the enemy. Fields gave way to marsh, where boots sank deep in sucking mud that clung like chains. Forests tangled with roots that twisted ankles and tore at cloaks. Rivers froze the legs as men waded through, teeth chattering, breath coming in sharp gasps as the cold claimed their strength. Rain turned paths to rivers of filth, while snow buried tracks until each step was blind. And yet, still, they marched. A Viking man did not expect mercy from the land, nor did he beg it he endured, for endurance was all the North had ever taught him. Night brought no peace. Tents were for the rich, not for those who carried axe and shield. The Viking warrior lay on the bare ground, wrapped in his cloak, the earth his bed, the stars his roof. Fires were kept small, for smoke could betray them to foes. Viking food, when it came, was a meagre stew shared between many, or stale bread softened in water. Bellies remained half empty, but no complaint was raised. Such hunger was as common as the frost. Sleep was broken, shallow, haunted by the cries of wolves in the distance and the cold pressing into bones. Still, amidst the misery, the march was a forge. Bonds were tempered in hardship, as men shared burdens, passing a shield from one to another when arms grew weak, or offering a handful of dried meat to a comrade close to collapse. Songs were sometimes raised, rough and harsh, not to celebrate, but to push the feet forward, to drown the silence of exhaustion. The Viking child who once wrestled in the yard beside his kin now marched shoulder to shoulder with them, their sweat, hunger, and pain binding them tighter than any oath. By the time the battlefield drew near, they were already tested. Faces gaunt, cloaks torn, bodies aching, but spirits sharpened like the edge of an axe. For those who endured the long march to battle, the fight itself almost seemed a release, an end to the endless road and the gnawing hunger. Survival before the clash was the true trial, and only those who had already conquered exhaustion and pain could raise their weapons when the enemy finally appeared. The battle did not begin with the first arrow loosed or the first axe swung. It began with the first step taken from the longhouse, and only the strong survived to see its end. Fire and iron were the true baptism of the Viking warrior. All the training, all the hunger, all the endless marches through frost and mud led to this moment, the raid. It came swift and without warning, a thunderbolt falling from sea or land. To the Viking man, it was not simply battle, but fate's proving ground. To the Viking child grown into youth, it was the final trial that burned away whatever softness remained, leaving only the hard edge of a warrior. The longship carried them silently toward shore, its prow cutting the waves like a spear through flesh. Oars rose and fell in rhythm, the only sound the hiss of water and the rasp of breath. Then, with a cry, the men leapt into the shallows, boots sinking in sand, shields raised, axes glinting with dawn's first light, villages still heavy with sleep stirred too late. Dogs barked, doors swung open, and before fear could take form, the fire was already rising. The raid was merciless. Torches thrown upon thatched roofs turned homes into blazing pyres. Smoke curled thick into the sky, screams mingled with the roar of flame, and the smell of burning wood and flesh clung to every breath. The Viking warrior pressed forward through chaos, shield braced, axe swinging. Every blow struck was not only against the enemy, but an offering to Odin, proof of courage in the storm. For the young, it was their first taste of blood. A youth who had once wrestled in the yard, who had hunted deer in the woods, now stood trembling with his weapon, slick in his grip. His first strike split more than wood. It split the boundary between boy and man. Blood splattered across his arms, hot and shocking, yet with it came a strange, fierce clarity. There was no turning back. From that moment, he belonged not to childhood, but to the brotherhood of warriors. The raid was not only slaughter, but plunder. Grain stores were emptied, livestock driven to the shore, silver torn from necks and wrists. Viking food was gathered in haste cheeses, dried meat, ale barrels rolled from cellars, all seized as spoils to keep raiders strong for the journey home. Thralls were dragged screaming, hands bound, destined for the longhouse, where their lives would never again be their own. To the victors, all of it was rightful payment for the risk of their blood. Yet the cost was heavy. Arrows loosed from desperate defenders struck shields and flesh alike. A Viking man might fall with a shaft through his throat, another with his skull split open in the struggle. Death walked beside them in every raid, and each youth learned swiftly that glory was no shield. The shield wall broke, reformed, pressed forward. Each step was claimed with blood and fire, until the village lay in ruin, its people dead, captured, or fled into the night. When the horn finally sounded retreat, the raiders withdrew as swiftly as they came. Smoke rose behind them, the cries of the conquered fading with the crash of waves against the shore. The longship groaned beneath its new weight livestock, goods, thralls, and weary men who bore wounds alongside their loot. For the young, the silence after was almost heavier than the noise of battle. They stared at their hands, at their clothes stained dark, at their own skin burned with ash. The world they had known was gone, replaced forever by the memory of blood and fire. This was the forging. A Viking child might be trained in the yard, might march until his feet bled, might strike at straw dummies until his arms failed. But only fire and iron could truly shape him into a warrior. The raid was his baptism, brutal and unrelenting, and only those who stood firm amidst the flames would live to raid again. For in the world of the Viking, it was not birth that made a man, but blood spilled beneath the burning sky. They called them sea wolves, and rightly so, for the Viking men who rode the whale road lived as much on water as on land. Life aboard the longship was no glory song of endless horizons and golden shores. It was misery endured with iron will. The deck was narrow, the benches cramped, and every inch of space was claimed by men, weapons, and stores. There was no shelter from the sky above, nor comfort from the sea below. The longship was both prison and path, a floating beast that carried its crew toward either plunder or the deep. A Viking child raised near the coast dreamed of the day he would set foot on the oaken planks, but the dream turned to hardship quickly. The first lesson of the sea was that it cared for no man. Rain soaked wool and skin alike until every garment clung heavy as chains. Salt stung the eyes, crusted beards, and split lips until they bled. Waves lashed the hull, spraying freezing water that numbed fingers on the oars. To sit for hours upon the bench, muscles burning with each stroke, was to feel the sea grind body and spirit to the bone. The longship itself was a marvel, but a harsh master. Light and swift, its shallow keel allowed it to slide across rivers and seas with ease, but that same grace offered little protection. When storms came, the ship rose and fell like a leaf tossed into the fury of giants. Men clung to the thwarts, knuckles white as water crashed over them, each wave threatening to drag them into the abyss. Many did not return from such voyages, their bones claimed by the sea, their names carried only by the spray. Food and rest aboard were cruel jokes. Viking food at sea was dried fish, hard bread, and ale sour from the cask, eaten cold and wet, chewed more out of necessity than hunger. Fires could not be lit, for smoke and flame risked both ship and secrecy. Sleep came only in fragments. A Viking man curled against his shield, cloak soaked through, dreaming of hearths that seemed as far as Valhalla itself. The sound of the sea was constant, the groan of wood, the slap of waves, the shriek of gulls, all reminders that the ocean never slept, and neither truly could they. Yet for all its torment, the sea gave freedom. From the longship's prow, a man could cross to kingdoms rich with silver, land upon shores ripe for plunder, or trade in markets where the goods of far-off lands gleamed like treasures of the gods. Each voyage was a gamble, each raid a bargain struck between courage and death. A Viking man understood this truth. The sea was not friend nor foe, but a power to be endured. To master the oar and sail was to master one's fate. The bonds formed upon those ships were unlike any other. Shoulder to shoulder, men rowed until their hands blistered and bled, their sweat mingling with salt spray, their breath rising in unison. They shared the same pain, the same hunger, the same fear when the horizon darkened with storm clouds. The longship forged them into kin, bound tighter than blood. A Viking child who survived his first voyage returned no longer a boy, but a brother in arms, tempered by sea and hardship. They were sea wolves, not because they conquered the waters, but because they learned to hunt upon them, lean and relentless, thriving where others would wither. The longship was their den, their prow the snout that struck first into foreign shores. And though every voyage carried the promise of death by storm, hunger, or blade, still they sailed, for the sea was both curse and crown. To live as a Viking was to endure the land's cruelty, but to ride the longship was to gamble with the gods themselves, and many chose the gamble, for only in the jaws of the sea could true glory be won. The shield wall was where courage was measured, where a Viking man proved himself not with words, but with his body pressed tight against the enemy's wrath. It was no loose skirmish, no wild charge of scattered men. It was order carved into chaos, a wall of wood and iron that stood or fell as one. To enter, it was to surrender the self, to trust the warrior at your side as much as your own arm, and to know that fear had no place, for once the shields locked, there was no escape. Each man's round shield overlapped the next, the weight of it biting into his forearm, his knuckles white against the boss of iron at its centre. Together they formed a barrier that stretched across the field, a wooden rampart bristling with axes and spears ready to strike. A Viking child who once played at duels with wooden planks now stood shoulder to shoulder with hardened men, the boy long gone, the warrior forged in his place. Behind the wall, the air grew thick with the sounds of breath, the shuffle of boots digging into soil, the murmured prayers to Odin and Thor whispered through dry lips. The first clash was like the hammer of the gods themselves. Enemy shields slammed into theirs, the sound of wood on wood and iron on iron roaring louder than thunder. Spears thrust from behind the wall, arrows rattled against it, swords hacked at the rims. Every strike shook the bones of those who held fast, each blow testing the strength of both arm and spirit. The shield wall did not shatter easily, but each man within it felt the storm as if it raged against his very chest. It was a brutal intimacy of war. A Viking man stood so close to his brothers that he could feel the tremor of their bodies, smell their sweat, hear their grunts of effort. If one faltered, the line cracked, and the crack became death. There was no room for weakness. The Viking warrior learned to push forward when his arm screamed, to raise the shield even as splinters buried into his flesh, to trust that the man beside him would do the same. Fear was not banished, but buried, pressed down deep beneath the weight of necessity. The enemy pressed hard, hacking, ramming, roaring, but the wall answered with fury of its own. Spears jabbed through gaps, axes swung over rims, and when an enemy stumbled too near, the wall surged forward, crushing him beneath a tide of shields and boots. Blood splashed the wood, arrows protruded from their edges, yet still the line held. Behind it, the younger warriors felt their hearts hammering like war drums, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and terror. But as long as the shield wall stood, they were part of something larger than themselves, something unbreakable. And when the order came to advance, the wall became a living beast. With a roar, it moved forward, step by step, driving the enemy back, the thud of shields and boots striking the ground in unison, like the heartbeat of war itself. The press grew tighter, the violence greater, until the clash was no longer a battle of weapons but of will. Whoever yielded first was lost, whoever broke was doomed. To survive the shield wall was to survive the storm. A Viking child who endured it walked away scarred, shoulders bruised, arms heavy, but soul tempered like iron. The shield wall was not simply defence, it was the crucible of courage, the test of whether a man could stand unyielding when the world itself seemed to crash against him. And for those who held the line, it was proof that they were true Vikings warriors who did not break, who stood as one, and who turned the fury of the enemy into the song of their own defiance. Blood and bond were the twin threads that bound Viking men together, threads stronger than iron yet fragile as a reed in the wind. In battle, side by side within the shield wall, friendship and kinship were not luxuries, they were lifelines. A Viking child might grow beside his neighbour, wrestle him in the yard, share bowls of thin porridge at the longhouse table. Yet, it was only in the storm of battle, when blood splashed their shields and death pressed close, that those bonds were truly forged. A Viking man trusted the warrior beside him more than he trusted the gods, for Odin might turn his face away, but a brother in the shield wall could not. Each swing of the axe, each thrust of the spear, was not only to save oneself but to protect the man at your shoulder. The bond was silent, unspoken, yet fierce. A glance in the midst of chaos, a grunt, a shield raised at just the right moment, such things meant life. To falter, even for a breath, was to condemn not only yourself but your kin, for the shield wall was only as strong as the men who stood unbroken within it. But bonds were not born only of battle. They grew in the long march, when hunger gnawed at every stomach, and one man shared the last crust of Viking food from his pack. They grew in the bitter cold, when cloaks were drawn tighter, and two men huddled together for warmth against the storm. They grew in the salt spray of the longship, when every oarstroke burned the arms, and each man kept pace for the sake of the others. The Viking child, raised in hardship, carried those lessons into manhood. To endure alone was strength, but to endure together was survival. And yet, death was always waiting to break the bond. One moment a brother stood beside you, his shield locked with yours, his voice raised in the battle cry. The next, he fell silent, an arrow jutting from his throat or an axe cleaving through his helm. Blood spattered across your face, his weight sagged against your shoulder, and then he was gone, swallowed by the mud and the chaos. The shield wall closed again, the line pressed forward, but the emptiness where he had stood cut deeper than any blade. It was this constant nearness of death that made the bonds so fierce. Each feast after battle was filled with laughter and heavy drinking, but beneath it ran the sharp knowledge that not all who had sat there before would ever sit again. A Viking woman might look around the longhouse and see gaps where once her sons, brothers, or husband had stood, now replaced by silence. Children learned quickly that joy was always shadowed by grief, that the man who tousled their hair one day might never return from the next raid. Still, these bonds were the marrow of Viking life. Songs were sung of men who saved their comrades at the cost of their own lives, of brothers who fought back to back until they both fell beneath a storm of blades. To betray such a bond was the deepest shame, to honour it the highest glory, for in the end, even the fiercest Viking man could not stand alone. Blood sealed the bond, and the bond gave meaning to blood. This was the paradox of the Viking world, that life could be snuffed out in an instant. Yet, in that fleeting time, friendships were forged stronger than the oaken beams of a longhouse. Death might shatter the body, but the memory of the bond endured, carried in saga and story, in the hearts of those left standing. And so, each warrior fought not only for glory, not only for the gods, but for the brother beside him, for the bond that made him more than one man standing alone in the storm. To feast and forget, this was the rare mercy granted to the Viking man and woman after endless days of toil and peril. In a world of hunger, frost, and bloodshed, the feast was not merely a meal, but a rebellion against hardship, a fleeting chance to cast aside fear and suffering. For one night, the longhouse roared with life, and the burdens of war, hunger, and grief were drowned in mead and song. The fire in the hearth burned higher than on ordinary nights, its glow chasing smoke into the rafters until sparks clung to the beams like stars. Viking food, once measured with careful hands, was heaped in abundance platters of roasted meat dripping with fat, loaves of bread still warm, wheels of cheese cracked open, and cauldrons of stews thick with barley and roots. What was usually rationed to fill the belly now overflowed, and the Viking child, wide-eyed, gnawed on bones as if they were treasures. Goat, boar, even venison, from a successful hunt, filled the air with their rich scent. For once, hunger was silenced. The mead flowed without measure, golden and sharp, poured into horns and cups until hands shook to lift them. It was not simply drink, but fire for the spirit, loosening tongues, blurring sorrow, and setting the hall alight with laughter. A Viking man who had marched half-starved through snow, who had faced death in the shield wall, now bellowed a song with foam on his beard. A Viking woman, so often bent with the weight of farm and home, let her voice rise in verse or jest, her cheeks flushed from drink and firelight. The thralls, too, on such nights, were given scraps of joy, allowed to taste a little of the revelry before the yoke of labour returned with the dawn. Songs carried the hall into frenzy. Skalds recited sagas of gods and heroes, weaving words that stirred pride and sorrow alike. Warriors boasted of raids, slamming fists on tables, their voices loud enough to shake the rafters. Others sang of lost kin, their eyes bright with unshed tears, mead spilling as they raised horns in remembrance. Each song, whether of joy or grief, was swallowed by the roar of the crowd, for all understood that both laughter and mourning were bound together in the Viking heart. The feast was not without danger. Too much mead sparked quarrels, and drunken boasts turned to challenges. Men wrestled on the longhouse floor, overturned benches crashing, blood mixing with spilled ale. Axes were sometimes drawn, and kin rushed to part the combatants before the celebration soured into slaughter. Yet even these brawls were woven into the memory of the night, retold later with rough laughter, the scars carried as proof of passion as much as recklessness. Children sat in wonder, watching their fathers transformed from weary farmers into roaring champions, their mothers from stern guardians into laughing women with songs on their lips. For the Viking child, these nights carved dreams as deep as any wound, dreams of glory, of battles sung in saga, of their own horns raised high one day. But the feast's greatest power was in its forgetting. The gnawing hunger of winter, the sting of frostbite, the ache of backs bent with labour, all of it vanished beneath the heat of fire and the haze of drink. For a few hours, the Viking believed themselves invincible, the hall a fortress of joy that no storm or sorrow could breach. Tomorrow, the fields would demand labour, the sea would claim its toll, the enemy would march once more. But tonight, there was only mead, fire, and kinship. To feast and forget was no idle luxury. It was survival of another kind. The feast gave the people of the north the strength to endure another season of cold and war. It reminded them that life, though harsh, still held sweetness worth fighting for. And so the horns were lifted, the songs bellowed, the fire roared one night stolen from the jaws of struggle, one night where even the gods themselves might lean closer to listen. Winter hunger was the truest enemy of the north, a foe no axe could split, no shield could turn. When the first snows fell, there was hope barrels filled with fish, sacks of barley sealed tight, meat salted and hung from the rafters. But the long dark of winter had no mercy, and as weeks dragged into months, those stores thinned, and hunger crept into every Viking longhouse like a thief. Pride and strength bent beneath its weight, and even the fiercest Viking man found himself powerless before the emptiness gnawing in his belly. The longhouse that once rang with feasting grew silent. A Viking child who had once laughed at the crackle of fire now sat hollow-eyed by the hearth, chewing on crusts of bread hard as stone, softened in broth until it barely held together. Viking food became little more than thin porridge, watered again and again until it resembled gruel more than meal. Meat, once shared freely on nights of plenty, vanished entirely. A sliver of fat, if found, was a treasure, licked clean until no taste remained. Mothers gave their share to their children, their own faces wan and pale, whispering that strength must pass to the young. The cold sharpened hunger into pain. Work still demanded to be done, wood chopped, animals tended, snow cleared from paths, but each task drew more from bodies already emptied. A Viking man who could swing an axe with ease in summer found his arms trembling in winter's clutch. Thralls, often given the least, sometimes withered away before the season's end, their labour claimed by the cold as swiftly as their lives. Desperation led to hard choices. Families scoured the forests for bark to grind into bitter flour. Seaweed gathered along the shore to chew like leather. Hunters set traps, praying for a rabbit or fox to stumble into their grasp, but often they returned empty-handed, their steps heavy with failure. Some even boiled bones already picked clean, hoping to draw out one last taste, one last measure of strength. Yet, no matter how clever, the famine pressed on, and each day's hunger was sharper than the last. In the darkest winters, the bonds of kinship strained. Neighbours eyed each other with suspicion, fearing theft of food stores. Thralls sometimes slipped away into the night, desperate for scraps elsewhere. There were whispers, unspoken but known, of families who turned to deeds too grim to name when all other hope was gone. Hunger stripped away pride, leaving behind only the will to live, no matter how bitter the cost. The gods were not forgotten in these times. Offerings were left at the hearth, bowls of what little food remained poured out as prayers to Thor or Freya for mercy. Yet when famine lingered, doubt crept in. Why did Odin turn his one eye away? Why did Freya's blessing withhold the harvest? Faith itself was tested, and some Viking men wondered if they had angered the gods beyond repair. And still, amidst the suffering, endurance remained. A Viking woman tightened her belt and worked on, weaving, tending, urging her children to rise though their legs shook with weakness. A Viking man braved the snow to cut wood, though his hands blistered and bled. Even the smallest Viking child learned that hunger was as much a part of life as fire and frost, and that only those who bore it with clenched teeth and unbroken spirit would live to see the spring. When at last the ice thawed and the earth softened, survivors stumbled from the longhouses gaunt but alive, fields were sown again, nets cast into the sea, animals tended with renewed care. The famine's scars lingered, carved into faces and hearts, but they were also proof. The people of the north had endured another winter, and though hunger had bent them low, it had not broken them. In the world of the Viking, to survive winter hunger was as great a victory as any won by axe and shield. The laws of the axe were the laws that truly ruled the north. Words might be spoken in the hall, judgments given by chieftains, or things decided at the assembly, but in the end, justice was carried not by parchment or pen, but by the weight of iron and the will to use it. A Viking man lived knowing that every quarrel, every oath broken, every insult spoken could end in blood, and that the law was as much a weapon as any sword or spear. Disputes often began with words over land, livestock, or honour, but words seldom ended them. A Viking child grew up watching tempers ignite like dry straw, a neighbour accusing another of theft, a kinsman demanding payment for an injury. The assembly, the thing, gathered to settle such matters, and there the people spoke, witnesses called, oaths sworn on rings of silver or iron. Yet, even as judgments were made, all knew that true justice often came after, in the dark of night or on the open field, when axe and blood determined what no counsel could. Wealth weighed heavily in these matters. A man of silver could pay fines, smoothing over grievances with coin or cattle. Wergold the man price was set to measure the worth of a life. The death of a thrall might be compensated with a fraction of what a freeborn life was valued, while the slaying of a Viking man of noble blood demanded riches enough to cripple an enemy's kin. For the poor, coin was seldom an option. Their justice was carved in steel, their honour defended only by willingness to strike. Blood vengeance was the truest law of all. If a man was slain, his kin were bound by duty to avenge him. To do otherwise was to invite shame upon the family, to stain the name for generations. Brothers hunted brothers, cousins clashed with cousins, and feuds stretched across years, staining the soil red. Children grew up knowing that the quarrels of their fathers might one day demand their own lives, that vengeance was not a choice but a chain binding them as tightly as any oath to the gods. Execution, when it came, was swift and merciless. A thief caught in the act might be struck down on the spot, his body left as a warning. A traitor or coward might be hanged from a tree, Odin's own gallows, swinging in the wind for all to see. Outlaws, the most cursed of all, were stripped of protection and cast from their kin, doomed to wander, hunted by any who wished to take their life. To be outlawed was a sentence worse than death, for it meant to stand alone in a world where no man survived without bonds of blood and fellowship. Even within the longhouse, the laws of the axe were felt. A Viking woman might carry keys to the home, might oversee thralls and food, but if dishonour stained her name, she too could face harsh judgment. Accusations of betrayal or witchcraft ended in trials by ordeal hands, plunged into boiling water, or bodies cast into rivers, the gods themselves called to decide guilt or innocence. Yet for all its brutality, this justice was not without purpose. In a land where kings held little sway and the gods demanded strength, the laws of the axe kept order through fear and respect. Men measured their words, for they knew insults could summon steel. They honoured oaths, for breaking them could mean their kin's ruin. And though it was cruel, it was also balance, a law born not of parchment but of survival. The Viking man carried his axe not only as a weapon of war, but as the emblem of his rights, his voice, and his worth. Justice was what he could defend, honour was what he could keep, and vengeance was the price of betrayal. These were the laws of the axe, swift, brutal, and final. Exile was the punishment that struck deeper than steel, harsher even than death. To a Viking man, there was no greater shame than to be cast from his kin, stripped of protection, and left to walk the world alone. Outlawry was not a sentence spoken lightly. for it cut a man away from the bonds that made life possible. To live as an outlaw was to be dead while breathing, a shadow walking the earth with no name, no home, and no hope of kinship. The Thing, the great assembly of free men, passed such judgments. There, beneath open sky, accusations were shouted, witnesses sworn, and verdicts given. Theft, murder, or dishonor could bring fines, vengeance, or wergild, but for the gravest crimes, or for those who could not pay exile, was the final word. A Viking child watching from the crowd would see the condemned stand pale before his people, his name spat with scorn, his worth erased in a single moment. To hear the word outlaw was to hear a death knell without mercy. Once outlawed, no kin could shield him. The protection of the law was stripped away, leaving him prey to any hand that sought his blood. His house was abandoned, his weapons seized, his wife and children left behind to bear the weight of his disgrace. He became a beast in the eyes of his people, less than a thrall, a wanderer cursed to find no shelter in longhouse or hall. A Viking woman, who once called him husband, was left widowed in spirit, her children fatherless, though their father still drew breath. To live outside the bonds of society was to live hunted. Roads, farms, and markets were closed to him. To set foot there was to risk death. Outlaws slept in forests, in caves, or beneath the open sky, their only companions hunger and fear. Viking food that once filled their bowls now had to be stolen, hunted, or scavenged, each bite won with risk. Wolves prowled the night, and worse than wolves were men, for any who killed an outlaw could claim honor, not punishment. Some outlaws tried to survive through cunning, striking like shadows against those who had condemned them. They became raiders of their own land, haunting paths, robbing travelers, or cutting throats in the dark. Their names turned to curses, whispered to frightened children. Others withered quickly, hunger and loneliness breaking their spirit long before the sword found them. Few lasted long, for the North was merciless even to those bound in kinship without it. Survival was a fleeting dream. Yet the sentence of exile carried its weight precisely because it was cruel. To a Viking man, kinship was life itself, and to be denied it was to be unmade. The outlaw bore no shield wall at his side, no brothers to raise him when he fell, no hands to share warmth in the storm. He was stripped of all that made a man more than a beast. Even in death, his shame lingered, for his bones were often left unburied, denied the rites that might carry his soul to Valhalla. A Viking child who heard of such punishments learned a bitter truth. That honor was not only about courage in battle, but about loyalty to kin and law. To betray those bonds was to face a fate worse than the axe, a fate where the world itself turned cold and empty. Outlawry was the severing of every tie, a sentence that hollowed a man until nothing remained but a shadow in the woods, waiting to fall. Exile and outlawry were the harshest judgments of the North, for they took not only life but belonging. Death in battle brought glory, but death in exile brought only silence. To the Viking, there could be no greater horror than to die alone, nameless, forgotten, cast from the bonds that gave meaning to the struggle of life. The price of faith was heavy in the North, for when the cross came, it did not arrive with whispers, but with fire and division. The old gods who had guided the Viking man through storm and battle, who had watched the Viking child take his first steps beneath Thor's hammer, were suddenly declared false. The priests of the White Christ spoke of salvation, but their words carried chains, and the clash of faith tore through households and kin as surely as steel through flesh. At first, it came softly, traders from the south, speaking of a single God, of mercy and eternal life beyond the grave. Some Viking men scoffed, raising horns to Odin and swearing that no southerner's god could command them. Others listened, tempted by the promise of peace, by the weight of silver that often accompanied conversion. Kings, ever hungry for power and alliance, were the first to bend. They saw in the cross not only faith but opportunity, and when a king knelt, his people soon felt the pressure to follow. But to abandon the old gods was no simple act. For a Viking woman who had whispered charms to Frigg during childbirth, to turn from her was to risk her child's life. For the farmer who left offerings to Freya in the fields, to forsake him was to gamble with famine. For the warrior who prayed to Odin before battle, to call instead upon the Christ felt like betrayal not only of the gods, but of every ancestor who had lived and died beneath their gaze. Faith was not merely belief, it was blood woven into every story, every ritual, every act of survival. The division was bitter. In longhouses, families were split across the fire. A father might cling to Thor while his son wore the cross. A daughter might be baptized by foreign priests, while her mother still left bread at the hearth for the household spirits. Feasts that once rang with songs to Odin now trembled with silence, for to raise a horn to the wrong god could spark anger as fierce as any feud. The Viking child grew confused, caught between tales of Valkyries riding the skies and the quiet promise of eternal rest in the halls of the Christ. Communities fractured. Some men swore oaths to the old ways, sharpening axes against those who had turned. Others embraced the new faith, protected by kings who demanded it, casting scorn on their former kin. Blood was spilled, not for land, not for vengeance, but for belief. In some places, sacred groves were cut down, idols smashed, temples burned. What had been holy to generations was trampled underfoot, and with it the hearts of those who still believed. Yet the cross spread, as relentless as winter. Its priests offered forgiveness that no Viking law could grant, mercy that no axe could deliver. Some who had wearied of blood feuds found comfort in its promise. Others bent to it out of fear, for kings who bore the cross enforced it with sword as surely as with sermon. And so, slowly, the hammer gave way to the cross, though not without screams, not without tears. The price of faith was paid in more than silver or baptismal water. It was paid in kin divided, in traditions lost, in the silence of gods who once filled every storm and flame. The Viking man who once raised his eyes to Odin now bowed his head in church, yet in the secret places of his heart he wondered if the old gods still watched, if they cursed him for betrayal. The Viking woman stirred her pot of Viking food, whispering half prayers to the Christ, half charms to the spirits, unwilling to let go of either. The clash of faith left wounds deeper than any raid. For the people of the north, it was not only a question of gods, but of identity, of who they were and who they would become. And in that struggle, many found themselves torn between two worlds, paying the heavy price of faith with their very souls. The final voyage waited for every Viking man and woman, no matter how fierce their strength or how deep their scars. Age, wounds, or sickness, these were foes that no axe could split, no shield could turn. Death was never gentle in the north. It came like the sea storm, sudden and merciless, or it crept like frost into the bones, slow but certain. A Viking child grew up watching kin carried to their graves or sent burning upon the waves, learning early that life was not promised, only borrowed for a time from the gods. For the warrior, the greatest fear was not death itself, but the manner of its coming. To die with axe in hand, with blood still hot on the shield, was the dream of every Viking man. Such a death was said to draw the Valkyries down from the storm clouds, their wings dark against the sky, to carry the brave to Valhalla, where Odin waited with mead and song. But not all deaths were so glorious. Many fell to fevers in the longhouse, their bodies racked by illness, their strength wasted away. Others were crippled by wounds that festered long after battle was done, their final days spent in pain, far from the clash of steel. For such men, fear gnawed deep, for they knew hell's cold halls might be their only welcome. The old bore their own kind of burden. A Viking woman bent with years still stirred the pot, still tended to the goats, even as her body ached. A Viking man too frail to swing the axe often sat by the fire, staring at hands once thick with callus, now trembling with weakness. To the young, they were reminders that even oak must one day rot, that even the strongest warrior would feel the slow creeping of time. Yet, age itself was not shameful. It was the manner of meeting death that decided honour or disgrace. When the end came, rites carried weight. Some were laid in the earth with weapons, cloaks, and offerings, their kin placing Viking food and drink by their side for the journey beyond. Others, of greater standing, were set upon pyres or longships, flames devouring wood and flesh alike, smoke spiralling into the sky as if to carry the soul upward. The crackle of fire and the wailing of kin were as common as the clash of battle, for death was no stranger to Viking ears. But even as they wept, the living honoured the dead with feasts. Horns of mead were raised, sagas sung of their deeds, and the hall echoed with both grief and pride. To remember was to keep the bond alive, for a Viking believed that, as long as their name was spoken, they still walked in the halls of their people. Silence, not death, was the true end. Still, fear lingered in every heart. For all the talk of Valhalla and the promise of endless feasts, every Viking child knew the darker fate that Hell's realm yawned wide for those who died in weakness, in sickness, or in shame. The final voyage could lead to glory or to shadow, and no man knew for certain which path awaited him until the last breath left his lips. Thus, the final voyage was the greatest test of all, one that no training or weapon could prepare them for. To meet it with courage was to embrace the fate woven long ago by the Norns, to accept the thread's end without faltering. To fear it was natural, but to yield to fear was ruin. The Viking lived knowing each day could be their last, and so when death came, they faced it as they had faced life, head high, teeth bared, whether in defiance or in welcome. For in the north there was no gentle passing, only the storm of life followed by the silence beyond. Valhalla or oblivion? This was the question that haunted every Viking man as he raised his axe. Every Viking woman as she watched her kin march to war. Every Viking child as he dreamed of the day he would stand in the shield wall. Death was no stranger in the north. It lurked in the sea, in winter's hunger, in sickness and battle. But death itself was not the terror. The true fear lay in what came after. Would the Valkyries descend, fierce and shining, to carry the fallen to Odin's hall? Or would Hel stretch out her cold hand, dragging the soul into her silent realm of shadows? Valhalla was the dream, a hall vast beyond measure, its rafters made from spears, its walls from shields, its roof thatched with the great hides of wolves. There, Odin waited, pouring mead from the udders of the cosmic goat, feasts never ending, laughter and song louder than thunder. The warriors who entered fought all day, their wounds healed at dusk, only to feast all night with endless meat and ale. For a Viking man, there could be no higher honour, no greater prize than to sit at those benches, his name sung forever in the company of heroes. But such glory was not given freely. Only those who died with courage, weapon in hand, could hope for it. To fall in battle was to gamble for eternity. A warrior who fled, who begged, who dropped his shield in cowardice would find no Valkyrie waiting for him. Instead, he would wake in Hell's realm, a place not of fire but of endless cold, where the dead wandered without song, without joy, without honour. To the Viking mind, this was true oblivion, a second death of spirit, where names were forgotten and glory turned to ash. The sagas spoke of the Valkyries, fierce maidens of war, their eyes sharp as the edge of a blade, their hair streaming like banners in the storm. They chose the slain, not all, but only those deemed worthy. A Viking child hearing these tales felt both awe and dread, for to be passed over was the greatest shame. A man could fight bravely all his life, but if fear clouded his last breath, if his axe slipped from his grasp, all would be for nothing. Fate was cruel, and none could know until their final moment whether Valhalla's doors would open or remain barred. Yet not all sought Odin's hall. Some longed instead for Folkvanga, Freya's field, where half of the honoured dead went to dwell. There, the goddess of love and war gathered her chosen, and though less sung of it, too promised peace and glory. But whether to Odin or Freya, the path was the same bravery, courage, and a death that spoke of strength. Still, doubts lingered. What of the farmer who died feeding his kin? What of the Viking woman who endured childbirth a dozen times, who kept her household alive through famine and storm? Were their sacrifices enough to earn a place beyond Hell's gate, or were they bound for silence despite all their strength? Not every life ended with the clash of steel, and so the question gnawed at the heart of the people. In the end, the uncertainty drove them harder. A Viking man swung his axe not only to live, but to carve a place in eternity. A Viking child trained with wooden swords, already dreaming of the day the Valkyries might descend for him. Songs were sung, horns were raised, not only to honour the dead, but to remind the living of what was at stake. For in the north, the choice was clear fight, endure, and perhaps feast with the gods, or falter and sink into hell's cold embrace. Valhalla or oblivion. It was more than belief, it was the fire in their veins, the reason they bore hunger, storm, and endless war. To live as a Viking was to live always in the shadow of that final judgment, never knowing until the last breath whether the next sound would be the beating of Valkyrie wings or the silence of hell's dark halls.